Hey guys, and welcome back to the Science of Exercise. Today we're going to be talking about Medballs in Hype or Hoax. So James, what are your initial thoughts on Medballs? Is it hype or is it hoax?
Well, to be honest, I think it's a little bit of a hoax. So I think there's some benefits to them, but when it looks at priorities of training equipment or things that I'd want to use, I think it's a little bit of a hoax. I think there's a lot of different alternatives to talk about.
Okay. So I'm going to actually take the opposition. I'm going to say hype. And this is coming from that strength and conditioning standpoint. And I think you're taking it from the standpoint of maybe at home or just general use.
Definitely, right? I think so. When you're looking at medicine balls, we have two different things to look at. So we can look at conditioning, and again, looking at cardiovascular fitness versus if we're trying to develop a specific element of fitness like strength and power. And so I just think, especially in a post-COVID world when we're looking at equipment I'd want to have at home or things I'd want to work out with, I don't necessarily think I'd prioritize trying to find a medicine ball, especially at current market prices.
Yeah, and I think that's really fair from that standpoint. So in that standpoint, if you're talking about an at-home piece of equipment and its uses, I mean, unless you're in a field and again, you're kind of wanting to train for performance, I would agree. And then again, with that limitation of being able to buy that thing, we're spending, ungodly amounts of money on it. I can agree with you that it could be a hoax from there, but where I go from that hype standpoint is its use in strength and conditioning, specifically, like you said, power, not necessarily strength, but power outcomes with certain athletes, specifically with rotary or overhead athletes. I find that the med ball is super useful because it's a relatively light tool, and the limitations on it are basically the creation or the creativity, I should say, of that strength and conditioning coach with that athlete. So that's why I like it. It's so versatile for power outcomes.
Well, and I think, and so it's funny, I was hoping I could catch you in something I could question you about, but you didn't fall for the trap there, which is, so you mentioned overhead movements and rotary movements, and so I think, the biggest thing that I think of when I think of medicine balls, especially for power development, is looking at things like throws. And so you mentioned, though, is that, throwing something overhead, I mean, I can throw almost anything overhead, or if I want to throw something in the horizontal plane, right, then I can use an explosive push-up movement. But I think for rotational, I think you're probably right. I don't think there's any good alternative. But, when it looks at things like conditioning, when it comes to things like, squats in like a goblet position, so using a medicine ball, I could just as easily use a cinder block. Or looking at thrusters, again, I can use any alternative weight source. I could use a single weight plate. But I do think there's definitely some niches where medicine balls really excel, but the question is that something that the general user wants, or is that something that's going to be more for truly just people interested in sports performance?
Yeah, I truly do believe its main use should be in sports performance, but I believe it's kind of a fun tool for people to use too, so it might change up that monotony of using quote-unquote a plate, right? I'm not saying that a ball is inherently better, but it's different, and that's kind of where you get down a murky path with that, right? It's like, are you buying a $60 piece of equipment that you could use for $10? But again, if it keeps that exercise adherence there, that's kind of where my mind goes for the general population. You see it used a lot in CrossFit, right? I'm not saying it's necessarily used for its perfect purpose. You could use other pieces of equipment that are substantially cheaper, like you mentioned. But again, if it's fun and it's enjoyable, maybe it's not necessarily wrong. I don't know.
Well, right, and that's the biggest thing, right? We always know that it comes down to is adherence, right? And is the athlete going to continue to train with it? But, I do think is that another great point that you bring up is partner workouts, which is if you have someone else you can train with, it becomes a much more useful tool, as opposed to, if I'm in a field and I'm doing throws by myself and I have to throw them and then walk to it and then throw them and then walk to it, again, I think it's probably good for my conditioning to have to chase after the ball, but I definitely think it's a lot easier to work with the tool if I have a partner, which I think is another major consideration for some people, whether they're training at home, whether they're training at a facility, and those kinds of settings.
Actually, that's a great point, and I completely agree with that statement too. So it sounds like we're both kind of taking both sides, and not necessarily saying that one is necessarily. Unfortunately, this is kind of like it's a hype in some categories, and it's a hoax in some categories. It depends, right? Is that common answer? But I think all in all, if I was to take like an overall approach with it, I think I would actually still side with hype a little bit more than hoax, just because the versatility of the piece of equipment, it's not limited to just being in the gym or just a quote unquote strength exercise. It can be used for power. It can be used for core. It can be used for, like you said, conditioning. It can quite literally be used anywhere, which is where I think it might be a little bit more hype than it is hoax. That's just a personal thing, though.
And I think, and it comes down to, so again, look at your budget, look at where you're training. And again, if it's something that you're going to get use out of, it's going to encourage you to continue training. Again, I can get on board with it being hype. Again, if I'm just at home, if I'm worried about budget, if I'm just looking to get in shape, I think it's a little bit of a hoax. So again, I think it depends, but as long as you analyze your individual needs and situations, I think it's definitely still a useful tool.
Right. Yeah, it's not like one of those just throw it out pieces. So
for sure.
All right. Beautiful. All right. First episode of Hyper Hoax, Medballs. Overall, Tyler, myself, I'm taking slight on the hype side of things. James?
Yeah, I'll go with as long as you've analyzed your needs and you're aware of what you're doing. I'll hype it up. Like I said, I think there's some very specific things you can do with it that you can't do with anything else, and I think that's enough to get some buy-in from me.
Oh, so I heard a little change in pace, little change in outcome there.
A little bit.
I'm sure I won't get many more of those throughout the series. All right. Well, until next time, guys, this was Hyper Hoax.